Greetings everyone, I am Dr. J. Star Wars Rebels is something I've been watching for a while now, and only in the last few months has finished its final season. After having watched it pan out, I'll admit that I'm a little sad to see it conclude, though at least it had the honor of concluding on a high note rather than having the plug unceremoniously pulled on it. For this video, it will primarily be a look back at the characters and circumstances, talking about the high points of the show and possibly highlighting some of the things to be mindful of in future endeavors. I'll do my best to keep the first part of this video spoiler free, but after a certain point, I'll make the assumption that you've seen the show and hold very little in reserve. With that said, let us begin. In a lot of ways, it was defined by our expectations of it. For a lot of people, it had to replace the Clone Wars TV show, and for that reason, it took me some time to finally sit down and watch it. What finally got me to do so was a very determined brother who is even more of a die-hard Star Wars fan than I am, and fortunately for me, the season premiere was exactly what I needed to get me into it. Right off the bat, it set a completely different tone, namely that of a fun space adventure with a ragtag team of rebels, rather than the anthology the Clone Wars had been. As a result, I was able to set aside the Clone Wars comparisons almost immediately, though I can understand why some would find it harder to let go of. In cases like that, fan expectations and speculations ended up being a hindrance. There are multiple points where characters from the larger universe make an appearance, which could lead to all sorts of fun possibilities, but since the show was meant to be focused on the main cast, that meant a lot of subplots that could have been interesting to explore ended up not being followed all the way through. As a result, there were a lot of self-inflicted wounds from the fanbase itself, with one of the best examples stemming from a Mandalorian subplot. For people unfamiliar with Star Wars, the Mandalorians are a warrior culture whose people are known for being ruthless, both to outsiders and especially to each other. However, one of the main cast, namely Sabine Wren, is a Mandalorian herself, and for part of a season ends up involved in matters concerning her homeworld. However, after taking 2 episodes at the start of the following season, they wrapped up the story where Sabine was concerned, despite the fact that many of us, myself included, wanted to see her play a more pivotal role. In hindsight, it makes sense why they did so, in order for her to be around for some really heavy-hitting episodes later on, but at that time, and even still a little bit now, it felt like we got cheated out of a really cool storyline. However, sometimes the issues with expectations were brought on due to how the show was presented and marketed. To tie back into the Mandalorian subplot, it started out with one of, if not the best episode of that season. Independent from the marketing and release schedule, it was followed up with an episode that was good, but nothing that could compare to the bombshell that had been dropped before. Unfortunately, that next episode aired after a month-long hiatus, which meant expectations were already set really high and made even higher by the wait, causing the reception to be lukewarm at best. Fortunately for anyone watching the show now, you might agree with something that I believe YouTuber Jeremy Johns said when he was going through the first 2 seasons. In those videos, he recommended that you wait for an entire season to be completed before you dive into it, and as someone who watched each episode as it came out, I think he's completely right. To explain why, let's look closer at the structure of the show itself. Typically when you're dealing with storytellers, they tend to fall into 2 categories. Those who are really good at character development but tend to have difficulty with the plot, or are really good at structuring the narrative but tend to have weaker characters. If this show is anything to go by, Dave Filoni falls into the latter camp, as the best way I've found to describe the show is by talking about the big picture. Said picture is focused around the crew of a freighter called the Ghost, who are operating out of a planet called Lothal. We learn more about the Imperial occupation there over the course of the show, but the Ghost crew's aim is to try and cause mayhem to the Empire and help out the citizens of Lothal as they are able. Even as their horizons expand to the larger galaxy, they find themselves continuously drawn back to Lothal for various lengths of time, as matters continue to escalate on the planet. The crew itself can be introduced by what Sabine says in the season premiere.
Who are you people? I mean, you're not thieves exactly.
We're not exactly anything. We're a crew, a team, in some ways a family.
Within the crew, you have the pilot and mother figure Hera Syndulla, who has spent the better part of her life fighting in some way against the Empire. Within the context of the story, she acts as one of the mediating elements of the crew. This is especially important since the show taps into the mystical side of the franchise by virtue of 2 other crew members, Kanan Jarrus and Ezra Bridger. Kanan is a former Jedi Padawan whose master sacrificed herself in order to save him from Order 66, and since then he had almost completely cut himself off from that part of his identity. However, in the season premiere, the street orphan Ezra Bridger causes them some trouble in what was otherwise a routine operation, and in the course of the episode learns that he's Force sensitive. Thus, the apprentice who never finished his own Jedi training ends up being a master of swords, which starts out about as well as you'd expect.
You're lucky I'm not my master. She'd never let you get away with
All the things you tried to get away with?
You want a second chance or not?
I mean, if you want to give me one.
I'm not giving you anything. Now go prep the Phantom.
As you say, Master.
This dynamic is the central one in the first season, and leads to some really great character arcs. All throughout the show, Kanan is having to grapple with who he was, who he is now, and what he's trying to be for Ezra. All while Ezra is, at least initially, out of his element. It's a good concept that the first season does a good job setting up, with later seasons further expanding on the idea. The main problem that the dynamic has is with Ezra himself, as a lot of people find him to be really annoying. Honestly, I sorta get the complaint, but I think to some degree that it's because of who the character is aimed at, specifically the younger crowd. Throughout the show, his growth is a matter of becoming more mature, of trying to make his way through the galaxy despite the tragedy in his life. And while I can understand why some people find him grating or obnoxious, it never really bothered me all that much. I mean, he starts out as a 14-year-old boy who finds out he has force powers. If he weren't abrasive to some degree, I'd be confused.
Wow, you must really be feeling the pressure.
Sorry, Jai. Who's under pressure? Not the guy who's won every assessment.
Yeah, but today I can taste victory.
You said that yesterday, and went hungry.
To further round out the roster, we have the Mandalorian warrior Sabine Wren, who, even within the Mandalorian archetype, is someone very different to that. While Mandalorian culture is known for its sense of honor and strength through combat, Sabine is, in some ways, the rebellious teenage version of that, as she's also an artist who routinely changes her look. At first it does seem like she's just the rebellious teenager, but as her backstory is explored, she ends up being one of the most interesting due to how she ended up with the Ghost Crew in the first place. To act as both comic relief and a source of mayhem, we have the astromech of the team, Chopper. And, well, there's really not much to say about him, outside of the fact that he's simultaneously the most evil droid in existence and the most caring one at the same time. This droid has absolutely no chill, and I honestly don't know whether I like him or hate him. All I know is that despite being one of the least well-armed members of the crew, he ironically has one of the largest body counts due to his antics, which is both hilarious and disturbing. So, to move swiftly on, we have the last member of the Ghost Crew, Zeb Aurelios, who everyone just calls Zeb. And honestly, it's hard to define him in terms of the crew, because he doesn't really fit into any one archetype. He can be a brute or act as the muscle at times, but when you have two Jedi on the team, they more than cover that particular job. He's not a tactical genius, though he does have some leadership experience and certainly isn't stupid. And like every character in the Ghost Crew, he has the tragic backstory that we learn more about as the show progresses.
Did they seriously leave you in charge of this entire facility?
Something wrong with that?
Well, I just always assumed you were more of a lift heavy things and punch anything in your way type. You know, a grunt. Precisely. Now, what exactly do you do?
What did he say?
He said, we've never really figured that out.
After thinking about it though, his role isn't defined within the Ghost Crew itself, but rather within the context of the show, as the everyman. He's not a Mandalorian warrior, a Jedi, a master pilot, or cantankerous droid, he's just himself. A character who isn't super complicated, but one who doesn't need to be, and one who works well with the other crew members. He may not have an evident place and he might not be everyone's favorite character, but he does add a fair amount by being just a guy within the galaxy, which, given the mystical elements they toy with later, acts as a good way to ground the viewer and the show as a whole.
This is good. When it gets strange like this, it's a good thing.
Where the other characters are concerned, the most pertinent ones are those taken from other parts of the franchise. In some cases, they'll cross paths with the character without interacting with them too much, such as for Lando Calrissian or Princess Leia. In other cases, they'll appear more often and play a more important role, with those characters tending to come from the Clone Wars TV show. Most notable among them is Anakin's former apprentice, Ahsoka Tano, clone veteran Captain Rex, and everyone's favorite pirate,
Hondo Onaka, at your service.
I won't go into too much detail in the first two yet, as much of why they work rely on spoilers for both this show and for the Clone Wars, but Hondo? Oh man, he might be single-handedly the best character that came out of the Clone Wars, just because of how ridiculous he is. He's a sweet-talking pirate who acts with all this style and charm, all the while being a loose cannon whom everyone knows might betray you if things start going south. He's basically what would happen if Minx from Baldur's Gate lived life as a pirate and wasn't quite so insane as to have a giant miniature space hamster for a pet, though the writing for him is just as perfect.
I don't deal with washed up old relics.
Come now, let's leave your wife out of this. There is no need for such impropriety among thieves.
Yup, that was a line that was almost certainly improvised, because when you're owned by Disney on Disney XD, you're usually not allowed to go full savage. Which does explain why most of the deaths in the show happen off-screen, but more on that later. That covers most of the characters I can talk about without spoiling things, as despite the marketing, there are some things that are best seen firsthand rather than discovered otherwise. So before I go into more detail, here is the last point I'll discuss. As I've tried to make clear while talking about the characters, this is a show about the grand narrative. When designing the show, it's pretty clear that Dave Filoni had a good sense of what was going to happen and where he wanted the characters to go. However, in order to get to that point, there are sometimes lulls in the action or points that, in the moment, aren't very well executed. In some respect, that's due to the narrative conflicting with what would be awesome in the moment, but to some extent, it's also due to the fact that the show is being aired on Disney XD.
We learned that the Inquisitors have a secondary mission to collect Force-sensitive children. What happens to these kids after they're abducted?
Nothing I can show on Disney XD.
If you were to look, you could find all sorts of comparisons between what the Clone Wars could get away with and what Rebels isn't allowed to show. Pretty much any kind of torture or means of murder was permissible in the Clone Wars, so long as there was little to no blood. But in this case, most of the death happens off-screen or is severely downplayed. There was one point where the main complaint on people's minds was the fact that the characters seemed more concerned with using their lightsabers to disarm opponents rather than taking them down, despite the fact that we do see them cause casualties in other manners. It also means that between the narrative and Disney XD, the tone often takes extreme shifts that don't always fit well together. In one case, a really heavy-hitting moment will immediately be followed up with an Imperial agent getting spray-painted as a means of humiliation, because bad things have apparently just happened and we need to lighten the mood by going on about our usual quippy ways. And that's all I dare say without entering spoiler territory, which to really talk about the good and bad I will sadly need to cross into. From here on, I will be acting under the assumption that you've watched the show, which if it hasn't been made clear thus far, I think is definitely worth checking out. It's not a show that will blow you away or wow you at every turn, but it's a solid Star Wars show that is absolutely worth checking out for anyone interested in the franchise. And what better way to celebrate that than by looking at the one thing this show absolutely nails, the villains. In general, the average stormtrooper is utterly incompetent, but in the grand scheme of things, that ends up being a positive. To start, it fits into the Empire's MO, where they focus on overwhelming force rather than efficiency. That means there may be the Imperial equivalent to the 501st Clone Battalion, but those would be the exception rather than the rule. More importantly, though, it allowed for the really effective agents to make themselves felt, which they did. The Grand Inquisitor in Season 1 wasn't on the level of Darth Vader, but for where Kanan was at the start of the season, he was more than enough to keep the Ghost Crew on back heel. Agent Kallus also proved to be a serious threat, especially given his rivalry with Zeb, and by the time he was growing less effective in Season 2, they had begun a redemption arc to neatly set him aside.
Well, you can't judge all assaults as the same.
Does that sentiment apply to Imperials?
All the Imperials I know.
Hell, even in Season 1 when things were starting to drag, all they needed was a little Grand Moff Tarkin getting involved. A character who was handled so well I thought the original actor was still alive. Honestly, if they were going to CGI Tarkin into Rogue One, they should have just used this guy as the voice actor, because holy crap is this a good impression.
In the absence of Governor Price, you have had a single, simple objective, Minister, to protect the Empire's industrial interest here. Interests which are vital to our expansion throughout the Outer Rim. But instead of protecting those interests, you have allowed a cell of insurgents to flourish right under your nose. Am I correct? And Agent Kallus, have you just stood idly by while this rabble have attacked our men, destroyed our property, and disrupted our trade?
I have exhausted every resource to capture them, sir. This group has proven quite elusive.
It's said their leader is a Jedi.
Ah, yes, let us not forget the sudden appearance of a Jedi, as if leaping from the pages of ancient history. A shame we don't have someone who specializes in dealing with them, otherwise our problem might be solved.
More importantly, the weakening usefulness of the Inquisitors and Agent Kallus gave way to Darth Vader being lit ultimate badass, coming in and severely crippling Phoenix Squadron. For a while, the Season 2 premiere would be the best action we had seen from Vader within the new canon, until Rogue One stole it with the hallway scene, only for the duel on Malachor to steal it back. The reintroduction of Maul also started a strangely symbiotic relationship that wasn't quite a hero-villain dynamic, but was still interesting to watch, especially with how it resolved. But where the villains are really handled well is the reintroduction of a Legends character whose significance is best demonstrated with the audience reaction to the Season 3 trailer.
Governor Price, these rebels have proven particularly stubborn. How do you intend to solve this problem?
I need someone who sees a bigger picture.
The Empire is getting better at anticipating our moves. I underestimated the commander. Previous attacks were clumsy, but this one was swift, precise.
To defeat an enemy, you must know them. Not simply their battle tactics, but their history, philosophy, art.
Grand Admiral Thrawn.
Carabast.
Grand Admiral freaking Thrawn. Timothy Zahn's legendary character, with whom the potential of the old expanded universe was first demonstrated, brought to life on TV. For my part, I didn't have any first-hand experience with Thrawn, as I've still to read Heir to the Empire or the canon Thrawn novel, but the cool, collected voice combined with the music, the fact that he stands out so much from everyone else, and the sheer fact that everyone was filled with glee at his return, should tell you all you need to know about how big of a deal this was. And even as other matters disappointed, Thrawn was not one of them. Part of this was due to the fact that Timothy Zahn was consulted on the character and gave the show his blessing, announcing along with the Season 3 trailer that he was writing the canon Thrawn novel. To an extent though, not everyone was happy with him, as it seemed like the Ghost crew got away with just a little too much. In some respect I agree, as I think one of the core 6 should have died in the Season 3 finale, but generally speaking, he was always a threatening presence, and even when the Ghost crew escaped or accomplished something, Thrawn always learned or accomplished something in kind.
They are in range, sir.
Hold your fire. They've earned their victory today.
Admiral, the rebels are getting away!
Oh, not to worry, Captain. I've found this whole experience to be very enlightening.
That meant, when he was finally prepared to strike at Phoenix Squadron, he was more than prepared to do so. In fact, they even managed to handle his defeat well. The one thing I was worried about when he was announced was how they were going to handle him, the TIE Defender, and later Rook. In Legends continuity, Thrawn had only been defeated through a twist of fate, with his personal bodyguard Rook turning on him. With the whole backing of the Empire, including the TIE Defender project at hand, how are they going to justify his lack of presence within the original trilogy? Killing him in a kids show would be difficult, as they showed him to be a superior tactician, but in my mind there simply wasn't a way that could explain his lack of presence without killing him. Fortunately for me, they didn't kill him, but simply took him out of the equation. Within his expertise, there were 2 weaknesses he had to deal with. The first were incompetent underlings, which allowed the rebels far more room to maneuver than they should have. We saw this firsthand in the Season 3 finale, where Admiral Constantine's pride and Governor Price's failings allowed the Ghost crew to escape. This was further amplified by Price walking into a trap within the Season 4 finale, allowing the Ghost crew to again get away with far more than they should have.
The rebels have captured Price. I have no doubt they've used her code to infiltrate the Imperial headquarters. To what purpose, I do not know.
I expected Governor Price to fail, but not so completely.
Even then, however, it would have been the end for them, as he was a tactical mastermind that had planned out most contingencies you could think of, at least for a battlefield. But in both the Season 3 and 4 finales, there was another weakness made apparent. He doesn't understand the Force. Assuming he had interacted with Vader or Sidious, his only understanding of the Force would be its application to combat, since that's all he would care about as a tactician. His understanding would echo Tarkin's, that of the Jedi not going as far as they need to in order to win, due to their strong principles.
How much longer are we going to wander through this tunnel in the dark?
Captain Tarkin, haven't you learned to trust me by now?
You may have earned my trust, General Skywalker, but my faith in your comrades is still lacking.
You lack faith in the Jedi.
I find their tactics ineffective. The Jedi Code prevents them from going far enough to achieve victory, to do whatever it takes to win. The very reason why peacekeepers should not be leading a war. Have I offended you?
No. I've also found that we sometimes fall short of victory because of our methods.
Well, I see we agree on something.
However, while it may have made them less tactically sound, it also left a blind spot that could be used to pull the rug from under him. In Season 3, there was no way he could predict the Bendu, and while he could subdue it, there was no way he could do so while still holding the rebels in check. And finally, how do you deal with space whales that come out of nowhere and either destroy or kidnap your entire fleet? I mean, if you were clairvoyant enough to take the Bendu literally, you might have seen it coming, but given that the Purrgil were seen only once before, 2 seasons ago, it came out of nowhere. And in that finale, it neatly explained everything away. Rook was killed in combat due to Sabine not being around to stop Zeb from being brutal.
Even with that bridge extended, there's just too many of them. We're gonna have to do something drastic.
All right, I'll do it.
Don't!
He's crazy! But it was your idea. Come on!
The TIE Defender project was shut down due to all the chicanery that happened with the Death Star, as well as being undone by prices over zealousness. And Thrawn as well as Ezra were neatly taken out of the picture for the entirety of the original trilogy, leaving Luke as the only viable means to stop Vader. Well, okay, Ahsoka was still alive, but let's be honest, she already knew she couldn't take him on a second time, and while I'm curious to know what she was up to during the original trilogy, I suspect that some things are best left ambiguous, at least for now.
You can't save your master, and I can't save mine.
Another really nice touch is that they still managed to either call back to previous moments in the franchise, as well as do justice to the characters that interacted with it. In terms of small moments, there are tons of parallels to, well, everything. When Ezra first finds Kanan's lightsaber, the sense of awe and the choreography mirrored that of A New Hope, when Luke first turned on his father's lightsaber. The specks of light within the Jedi Temple that followed Ezra were the same ones which Qui-Gon manifested as in the final arc of the Clone Wars. As another nod to the Clone Wars, the way Kanan introduced himself to Fen Rao mirrored Plo Koon's introduction to a bartender, which despite the different circumstances was a really nice touch. Even the character designs themselves were taken from old Ralph McQuarrie drawings and concept art, which allowed them to have their own distinct look without being out of place in the wider galaxy. To take this a step further, entire story arcs seem tailored to wrapping up or continuing lingering plot threads from the Clone Wars, such as the episode where Rex encountered the old Separatist holdout. It was a really well set up episode that may have ended on a sappy note, but did grant some closure for him after everything that occurred. Even beyond that, his introduction into the show was a perfect juxtaposition to Kanan, given how Order 66 affected both of them. Their subplot of learning to work with and trust each other was one of my favorites from Season 2, as it was like watching an old married couple argue over the kids. So with that said, let's go back through the best that the show has to offer. These are episodes that we'll put on repeat or remember for how much of an impact they left. And while some of them pertain to other characters, the Ghost Crew's involvement often had a pivotal role in the matter. While most will admit that Season 1 was fairly shaky, there are 3 episodes that I would like to highlight. To start with, let's look at the series premiere, which, as I mentioned earlier, was the perfect introduction to the show. Right off the bat, they introduced the lighter tone, established the characters, and at least for me, dispelled the comparisons to the Clone Wars all in one fell swoop. There were also enough nods to the original trilogy, from the design of the characters to discovering Kanan's lightsaber, to where I was happy to give the show the benefit of the doubt. The second episode I want to showcase is the visit to the Jedi Temple, which was a great character moment for both Kanan and Ezra, and really solidified where they were at the time and how they were hoping to move forward. Although, I may be biased on this one, because the initial premise was a great one, but introducing Master Yoda with Frank Oz at the helm really made it work for me. He got to show both the cheeky and wiser sides of his personality, was able to strike at the heart of what Kanan and Ezra were struggling with, and really brought everything together nicely.
Kid's taking too long.
Patience. Remember you nothing of your own training?
Master Yoda! Can't be. I'm losing it.
Losing? Lost? Yes. But what lost, The question that is.
Master? How can this be?
Be not concerned with how. Know I am here because you are here.
Thank you, Master.
Thank you? Nothing have I done.
The one thing that a lot of people don't like from that episode, though, is Ezra's lightsaber. And while I understand the criticism, I don't fully agree with it. Most of the criticism boils down to either complaints that it was only created to sell toys, or the fact that it doesn't really seem like an elegant weapon from a more civilized age. To the former, I'm not going to dispute that financial viability wasn't a factor. I think it's overly cynical, as Filoni seems like he wouldn't do it if the story didn't call for it, but then I have to explain why it would call for putting a blaster of sorts on a lightsaber. Well, honestly, I don't think the Ben Kenobi line about the lightsaber being an elegant weapon really applies to someone who has never been alive while that more civilized age existed. He's a teenage straight rat with force powers, and you expect him to not try something crazy or silly with it? It's just the kind of thing something like him would come up with. And if it makes you feel any better, Vader is quick to strike it down on Malachor. And finally, where Season 1 is concerned, the finale was the perfect send-off for the season, wrapping up the current plot threads while still leaving room for the story to continue. Kanan gets his opportunity to shine in what at the time was his best line in the show.
That was a mistake.
Why? Because you have no one left to die for you.
No, because I have nothing left to fear.
Ahsoka is revealed as Fulcrum, which led to all sorts of excitement for what her involvement would entail. But the real fun came immediately after that, with a scene that needs no other introduction than the one Tarkin provides.
We are getting reports of unrest all over Lothal. There are whispers from Mustafa. Some people see the Empire as weak, vulnerable.
Not to worry, Agent Callus. The Emperor has sent an alternative solution.
Darth Vader. We didn't even need to see him directly to know exactly what that breathing meant, and the fact that he said nothing only made it better, setting him up as the Sith on a mission, looking to bring down the rebels swiftly and brutally. And luckily for us, the season premiere would not disappoint, as he would simultaneously put Kanan and Ezra in their place, force them to leave Lothal for the majority of the season, and then single-handedly outgun Phoenix Squadron and destroy their capital ship. So yeah, good times all around for the audience, not so much for the Ghost Crew and their newfound allies. Unfortunately, where Season 2 is concerned, a fair number of the episodes were hit and miss. On one hand, going back to what I said before, a lot of the episodes did play a role into the grand narrative, or the individual story arcs, but it often felt like the show was in a holding pattern. Sure, the episode involving Ketsu bridged the gap in Sabine's life between the Imperial Academy and the Ghost Crew, but it still had Ezra being annoyingly flirtatious and oblivious to social cues. The episode involving the Blade Wing was a nice way to explain the B-Wing's origins and did expand on Hera's love for flying, but in the grand scheme of things, the former wasn't the most important to know, the latter we could already guess from previous encounters and wasn't really necessary for the Ryloth episode later on, to say nothing about the slow pace of the episode as a whole. As for the Space Whale episode, well, that was one that I didn't mind so much at the time actually, and given what happened in the series finale, I'm surprisingly okay with it. Despite the fact that a lot of episodes meandered, there were still a lot of great moments. I've already discussed the dynamic introduced with Rex, but on top of that, watching Ezra grow more confident and possibly a little more aggressive was really nice to see. And while Ahsoka didn't show up very often, when she did arrive, it left an impact. In fact, I would argue that it's because they held her in reserve that she did leave such an impact, because outside of the season finale, we only see her in combat once, where she gets to show up Kanan by systematically beating both of the Inquisitors on her own. In some ways, a lot of those moments are made by the music, which is something I haven't discussed much yet, but really want to hammer home now. It's light and airy when it needs to be, it's looming and mysterious when it needs to be, and whenever the choir is introduced, it's always perfectly utilized. If I'm not lazy while editing this, you'll have seen the fight with the Inquisitors without any sound or music, and on its own, you can still appreciate the efficiency of Ahsoka's actions, and how she's able to work around them. But now let's see it with the sound turned back on. most people, where the show peaked was in Twilight of the Apprentice, where everything built up to in Season 2 finally paid off. Leading up to that, we had another great episode in the Jedi Temple, where Kanan was officially given the title of Jedi Knight, Ahsoka gained clarity as to where her former master was, and Ezra got the true highlight, namely the words,
"Find Malachor."
To an extent though, they almost set up the episode for failure, because as the next 2 episodes air, all I could think of was, this isn't Malachor, this isn't Malachor, oh, Chopper has a sarcastic friend for all his sarcastic needs, that's nice, but this isn't Malachor, oh look, we're going after giant spiders and the pressure is getting to Ezra, all while not being on Malachor. Okay, good, Ahsoka's finally here, can we go to Malachor now? Wait, we can? Great, let's do this!
Leroy Dragons!
That meant when we got to finally see Malachor, when it finally came time to see everything that transpired, I thought it was going to be like the episode reintroducing Rex. A fine episode, but one that meandered for a while and wasn't necessarily the best reintroduction to the show. Instead, we got what might be the best episode of TV that Star Wars will ever see. The pacing was perfect, the conflict well structured and well executed. The storyline involving the Inquisitors were resolved in a satisfying way while setting up new scenarios with Maul and potentially a much darker Ezra Bridger. But most importantly, it gave us the duel, one which we had been anticipating ever since we learned Anakin had an apprentice, and that said apprentice had survived Order 66. Everything about that episode was perfection, save for 1 or 2 details like the Saber copters. And yes, I know I just ruined the good mood by bringing them up, but frankly it's a good thing that the Inquisitors were taken out of the picture, because we did not need to see that more than once. Everything else though, from the Sith Temple, to the action, to the writing, to the literally everything else, absolute perfection. To a degree where not even the second half of Season 4 can top it. And frankly, all I need to prove my point is this moment right here.
I was beginning to believe I knew who you were behind that mask, but it's impossible. My master could never be as vile as you.
Anakin Skywalker was weak. I destroyed him.
Then I will avenge his death.
Revenge is not the Jedi way.
I am no Jedi.
Hell freaking yes. Unfortunately for the Season 3 premiere, not even the reintroduction of Grand Admiral Thrawn could make it hold a candle to that finale, especially since it seemingly wrapped up the Dark Ezra storyline before it could really blossom. If done right, that's an arc that could have spanned half the season and had serious implications for, well, everything. But sadly, to make way for Thrawn and the other characters, it got resolved in the premiere and was never heard from again. Fortunately, there were plenty of other moments that were built up to, well, and paid serious dividends. To start with, there was the Dark Saber episode. After a run-in with Maul and some time to think about it, Kanan shows Fen Rao the weapon which Sabine found at Dathomir. In it, we learn more about the weapon's history, acting as a good primer for those who didn't watch the Clone Wars, and a nice bit of trivia for those of us who have. But then we come to the moment where Sabine has to learn to use it, which was an excellent character moment for her. When I was discussing the Mandalorian subplot, this was the point where it all came together. All of the scattered information we had about Sabine's backstory, including the stubbornness you would expect from a Mandalorian.
Sabine is blocked. Her mind is conflicted. She's so expressive and yet so tightly wound. She's so...
Mandalorian.
Ugh, very.
All of this culminating into one of the best character moments that cemented Sabine as arguably the best character the show created. And while that arc may not have ended the way we hoped for, there was also the arc with Maul, which was really well done. It tied nicely into where Kanan was, involving the Bendu in a way that made sense given what little we know about him, and with enough motivation from all sides to see it through. But where things really got serious was when we reached the apex, the episode right before the season finale, Twin Sons. The point where Ezra finally ran off to try and do what he thought was right, only to get a stern talking to from ObiWan himself. And ObiWan, holy crap did they do the original Alec Guinness performance justice. As this is exactly how I would expect him to behave. It was the perfect way to handle the circumstance for both characters, but what really made it great was what came after.
Now the only one who has gained anything from all of this is... me.
The final confrontation between Maul and ObiWan. As Maul had said earlier,
it ends where it began. A desert planet with twin suns.
Thus, Ezra was whisked away, and the adults were left in the room to hash it out. And hash it out they did, because the moment I heard Maul guess at Obi-Wan's purpose, I knew in that moment, okay, Maul's dead, it's official, now let's see how this goes. Okay, they're setting up. Sizing each other up. Eventually someone's gotta make a move, and here we go! Yes! Wait, that's it? Nope, I didn't see him get hit. Those plates certainly did. Oh, I guess that was it. Huh. Okay. At the time, I'll grant you that my reception to it was a little lukewarm, but after thinking about the circumstances, I actually think it was a good send-off. For a lot of us, I think we were expecting something much different, as the last time we've seen these two face off, it was a brutal confrontation in the Clone Wars. On top of that, we had already seen one duel in a past season between two people that we were really looking forward to, and in that duel there was a lot of raw emotion poured into it, leading us to expect a similar situation for this conflict. Here though, ObiWan is a much different person, and this is a much different circumstance. Maul is still clinging on to his desire for revenge or ownership of the situation, having seemingly lost everything, while Obi-Wan's new goal isn't to face down old rivals, but rather to protect Luke at all costs. As a result, Obi-Wan isn't interested in a flashy fight, nor would he mince words regarding the matter, and thus we instead get a fight that's more about being one step ahead of your opponent, rather than something meant to surprise and overwhelm. It also goes a small way to line up with how we fought Darth Vader in Episode 4, though I won't claim it erases all of the problems with that fight in particular. Within that episode, there's also something which I haven't seen discussed much, but is still interesting to think about. The whole reason for Ezra going there was supposedly to find the key to destroy the Sith. But if Obi-Wan is to be believed, it seemed as if, in actuality, his mental state had merely been a sideshow that Maul could manipulate in order to find Obi-Wan. And yet, in a strange sense, I do think Ezra was looking in the right place. He may have seen Obi-Wan, as that was Maul's target, but he also saw Tatooine as a whole. In a sense, Ezra had found what he was looking for, from a certain point of view. He had found the man who was safeguarding the key to destroy the Sith, Luke Skywalker. But in the end, that wasn't something Ezra needed to worry about. His part to play in all of this was merely to give the rebellion a fighting chance. He had his friends and his training, which proved to be enough in order to save Lothal and arguably the galaxy as a whole. If the TIE Defender project had gotten off the ground, the space battles we've seen would likely have gone much differently, and not in the Rebels' favor. In another capacity, it also gives more weight to Obi-Wan's purpose, as, in a sense, it confirmed what he believed the boy to be, a new hope for the galaxy. And thus, without even directly interfering with him, suddenly Luke's importance is further amplified in the times to come. Honestly, after talking about something so significant, it's hard to know what to follow up with, especially since when it comes to Season 3, much of it is focused on building up to what we've already discussed. The start of Season 4 is a similar beast, as well as nice to see Yavin 4 and to interact more with Mon Mothma, it again felt like a holding pattern until we got to Lothal. And even then, the stakes weren't really there until right before the mid-season break, when Hera was captured. After that though, the season returned from that break for its last few episodes, and this time, instead of coming back in with something generic, the animation team had seemingly learned their lesson and started with a really hard-hitting episode. Everything seemed to go according to plan, at least initially, and despite the serious tone, there was enough time for levity between Kanan and Hera that it was fun to watch. But then we come to that scene. I could vapidly point out all sorts of things ranging from Kanan's sight seemingly being restored in that instant, the music punctuating the scene, and so much more. But it all seems hollow at this point. Nothing that I could say would really be able to capture the emotion that went into it, even though, based on comments that I saw online, I was almost certain this would be the end for him. So, yeah, it was a really good thing that the next episode was spent with the crew trying to cope, because they weren't the only ones that needed it. Ugh. But if the second half of Season 4 was anything, it was consistently throwing bombshell after bombshell at us, with the next pair of episodes really throwing us for a loop. Going back to the Jedi Temple, Ezra finds himself in a world between worlds, which ends up being an odd detour at first, as he's stuck in a strange place that we have little to no reference for, with voices that we as the audience know echoing everywhere.
Truly wonderful, the mind of a child.
What is this place?
A conduit through which the entire force...
Luminous beings are we, not this truth factor. Train yourself to let go of everything you fear to lose.
What you need, you already have. Unfortunately, you seem to be letting it all go.
I won't let him lose his way. Not like I did.
To center us, we see the convoy which had been following Ahsoka around in Season 2, which eventually pointed Ezra toward a vision of the past, of the duel between Ahsoka and Vader, right as the Sith Temple was closing in around them. But then we find out that it isn't just a vision of the past, but a portal to it. And before anyone realizes the implications, this happens.
Ahsoka!
The Apprentice Lives. I don't even know what to say, and honestly I'm not gonna try. I could spend the next 5 minutes just doing nothing but going, holy crap, she actually is alive, she's not just ambiguously left on Malachor, holy crap, she's still alive! And I still wouldn't get the point across. So, yeah, this was serious news, because in the aftermath of the Season 2 finale, everyone had their own theory as to whether Ahsoka was dead, alive, in some kind of purgatory, or any number of other things. And thus, here was our answer. A weird sort of time travel. Years later, Ezra would find his way into a secret part of the Jedi Temple, a world between worlds, and pull her out of danger, just as Vader was about to strike her down. And then to relive the moment where Kanan died, only for the Senate to reveal himself and attempt to capture the two of them! How many other bombshells are they gonna drop in this one? I don't even have time for the fact that some form of time travel was introduced in the Star Wars because it's the freaking Senate, and Ahsoka just fought 3 Sith Lords over the course of an hour, and how the heck did Filoni plan this far ahead? Because he clearly planned this far ahead, looking at the arc where he put out, and I don't have words anymore. Okay, you know what? Time to get off the fanboy high horse. Trying to take this seriously. I mean, I'm not going to make any promises that I will, but try, okay? Okay. Now, the inclusion of time travel is a somewhat difficult matter to critique due to the danger that such a precedent could set. In other universes, time travel is often used as a means by which stories are swiftly rebooted or made incomprehensible due to all sorts of chicanery being involved with it. Thankfully, in this context, I can safely say that I can live with it being a factor, because the means by which it can be accessed is kept locked away in very specific places, seemingly related to the Force in some capacity, and because it seems they opted for the closed-loop approach rather than the damn-it-bury approach. In essence, the future can't be changed because it's already happened, and any knowledge of it will only lead to it panning out in the exact manner you've already seen. And then following that, we have the 3 final episodes of the season, where everything built up to a fever pitch and beautifully concluded it. It started out with putting the rebels on the clock, and then setting up a scenario where you're not entirely sure whether Ryder is going to betray the rebels or just lure Price into a trap. Given how close they came, it could have gone either way, especially given Ryder Rosati's voice actor. And yes, I know that Filoni wouldn't necessarily make casting decisions like that, but come on, when you're known for playing Lex Luthor, that has to cross your mind. Either way, it was a good setup for the finale where everything came to a fever pitch. A desperate gamble worthy of the Jedi of old. A callback to the Jedi Temple. One last chance for Ezra to turn back on everything, only to greatly disappoint the Senate by destroying it. Down below, they made a desperate bid to protect the city, and with some unexpected help, are able to completely expunge the Empire, despite the best efforts of Thrawn and his agents. Everyone got the ending they deserved, and now we need only look to the future, where there are more than a few threads they can expand upon. Ahsoka is still around, meaning a conversation between her and Luke is not only possible, but likely. Hera's son, Jason Syndulla, appears to be Force-sensitive, which could lead to yet another bittersweet tale depending on whether he's involved at Luke's Jedi Academy. And finally, Ezra and Thrawn are still out there, off on trails that we have no knowledge of yet. And thus, only time will tell what ends up happening from here. And with that, I believe now would be a good time to end the video, as while there's a ton of speculation that I could do about the future of the license, I don't want to fall into the same trap that I did with Rebels, and after the second half of Season 4, I'll be keeping a close watch on anything that Dave Filoni is working on. Heck, you could give him the reins to literally everything in the franchise and I would be more than happy to see it. Anyway, thank you all for watching. Please like and share this if you find it deserving, and subscribe to this channel for more in-depth discussions as well as other content posted on a weekly basis. Generally speaking, I spend my time talking about older video games, but for franchises that I grew up with like Star Wars, it's hard not to spend an inordinate amount of time discussing the newer material. That will likely mean if I end up watching the Han Solo movie, I might decide to talk about it, but I have a feeling that I'll want to wait until the reviews are in. I can't describe why, but something about the trailer feels off to me, as if something isn't quite the way it should be. I can't put my finger on what just yet, though I may be jumping at shadows given what I've heard about its tumultuous production. It could end up being good, as I liked Rogue One despite its production troubles, but this one seems different somehow. Either way, I'm sure we'll find out before too long, so here's hoping that it does turn out to be a good movie. For now though, I have other video ideas that I want to try out, preferably ones that don't involve as much editing as this. So, I'm gonna go work on those, and we'll see you all later.